And at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, Institute for Contemporary Affairs. One of the things we try to do, as many of you know, because many of you are part of the JCPA family, regular guests, is provide you, especially in critical situations such as the current war, with context and perspective to try to make informed judgments, whether reporters or diplomats, and to try sometimes to zoom out a little bit from the field of battle that we currently are facing, and try to get also the tactical picture, but also the larger strategic picture. And of course, what we had sent you was an invitation in which the chairman of the Institute for Contemporary Affairs, Major General Yaakov Amidror, was to be sitting here. Now, as many of you know, Amidror has a beard, and Brigadier General Yossi Kuperwasser, who also was the former head of intelligence assessment, it does not have a beard. Major General Amidror is sick at home with pneumonia. And I must say and publicly thank with the warmest embrace Brigadier General Yossi Kuperwasser, who has been here with us on a number of occasions in critical strategic moments, immediately answered the call and said, yes, I would be delighted to come and share some comments with diplomats and members of the foreign press here. So we are enormously grateful to you, Brigadier General, that you were able to do that, and we wish the best, of course, the warmest wishes for a quick recovery to Major General Amidror. But Brigadier General Kuperwasser will be providing the military strategic part of the assessment this morning. And of course, it goes without saying that our President, former UN Ambassador Dr. Dore will provide the analysis and observations on the diplomatic side of things, which, as we all know, are picking up steam and great energy at the United Nations. And of course, the guest of President Sarkozy is here and has visited, and there are all kinds of intensive diplomatic discussions going on about the terms of a potential ceasefire and then how that would affect the local situation on the ground. So what we're going to do, with your permission, is to ask Brigadier General Kuperwasser to share his observations with you. Many of you who watch international television have seen him all over all the major networks, and as well as the Israeli ones over the last days. And he will share his observations with you about where we are from a military point of view, and then he'll turn over the floor to Ambassador Gold, who will take the diplomatic side, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks. And, good noon. I think that much of the things that I'm going to speak about is already some sort of in the public domain, but I'll try to at least make some order in much of the information that is available, and try to discuss in this respect what are the capabilities of Hamas, how it is built, what are we actually facing in Gaza, and what is the situation to the extent I can understand it right now on the ground, and where it might develop. So basically, as you know, Hamas has controlled the Gaza Strip for a year and a half, more or less, and has been very strong in Gaza for a long time. And they have developed a system that has the capability to carry out violent activities in Gaza that actually used to control Gaza until the last few days. The structure of Hamas is made basically of three elements. One is the famous Izzedin al-Kassam unit, that its purpose is to carry out terror operations against Israel. This by itself is made of several sub-units. Some of them are involved in carrying out ground operations, kidnappings, like the one that kidnapped Gilad Shalit, operations along the border, preparations for operations inside Israel if possible in the future. Some of them did carry out these kind of operations from Gaza until some time ago. Another unit that is very active is the one that carries out the rocket launching operations. And they are deployed in different areas of the Gaza Strip. And they carry out these operations based on stockpiles that they have of rockets that are prepared by another unit that they have, and this is the production unit. And the production unit is the one that has produced most of the short-range rockets, the Kassam rockets of the various kinds that they have, and some of the longer range, up to 20 kilometers, or maybe even a little bit more, that they have launched so far. And within this unit, they also have the branch that is responsible for smuggling, and this unit is very active in bringing in weapons from Egypt. That's actually the only way through which they managed to get weapons for quite a while, using the tunnels underneath what used to be called the Philadelphi corridor, the border between Gaza and Egypt. To the best of my understanding, last number I heard was that there are something like 200 tunnels over there. Some of them extremely big. So actually they can bring in almost everything. Maybe not tanks, but almost everything short of that. And because of that, this was a vital route for the Hamas to equip themselves with all kinds of weapons. The weapons, some of them come from regular smugglers that just do it for making good money, and as far as I understand, this is the major source of income for many people in Sinai in general, and in the Rafah area in particular. And some of it is an Iranian-sponsored operation, because the long-range rockets that we see today in Gaza are rockets that were provided to the Hamas by Iran, by the IRGC. These are the 40 kilometers rockets. These are an extended range Grad rockets. You know, the original Grad is a rocket for something like 20 kilometers range, but the same kind of rocket that was given by the Iranians to Hezbollah, and enabled Hezbollah to reach Safad and many other places in the Galilee in 2006. Are the same rockets that were provided by the Iranians to Hamas. There's a big question mark as in regards to the number of rockets of that kind that the Hamas has. From the way they use it, I mean, there was some days in the beginning that they used it in a way that gave the impression that they have many of these. In the last few days, the use of these rockets has become a little bit more cautious. So maybe it reflects the fact that they have to take into account the possibility that this is going to be a long war. So they would like to have the ability to launch those rockets as all along this operation, and definitely keep some for the end, and keep some in their storage even after. So maybe they're going to be more cautious on using those rockets. Anyhow, this is the Din al-Qassam part of the Hamas. Another part of the Hamas is the forces that are supposed to be protecting the Gaza Strip against other elements, and primarily Israeli, but also from any internal threat that may arise from Fatah supporters and so on. These are basically organized in a way that they have a unit in each neighborhood, but especially along the neighborhoods that are the first to face the Israelis. since Gaza is so small and long, almost everywhere this can happen. And these are the units that are organized in brigades today. And each brigade is made of battalions, and each battalion is made of companies. And the companies actually are responsible for a certain area. This is the force that we are now engaging, not in a too intensive manner, in the areas where the ground operation has taken place. And on top of that, they have some security, internal security units that take care of security of the commanders and so on and so forth. So basically, what you see here is a well-organized infrastructure, which, for the Hamas point of view, is, on the one hand, a source of strength, but at the same time, it's also a source of weakness, because it raises their vulnerability. And whereas in 2006 we had to fight against the Hezbollah people that were hiding here and there, and there was no such place that you can call the center of the force, and with a sign on it. Here in Gaza, the situation is different, and there are many, since Hamas is the governing element in the Gaza Strip, there are many targets that you can say, well, this is Hamas. Okay, there's a sign on it. We are Hamas, so you can attack it. And that's what happened in the first phase of the war. We took action against those targets that were Hamas, clearly, and could have been hit. But at that stage, what happened was that the damage we did to the operational force of Hamas was important, but not critical. We did manage to hit many of the production centers of the rockets. And that was quite painful for Hamas. We did manage to hit some of the storages of the rockets, which was also a problem for Hamas. But we didn't hit enough here and there, but not in a manner that accumulatively creates strategic impact. We here and there hit some people from the Israeli Kassam, some key figures, and it was very important, but it didn't have strategic impact on the ability of Hamas to continue to operate in the Gaza Strip. That's where the ground operation came into being, and the ground operation its purpose is to put more pressure, to engage the people directly, and to force them to expose themselves, and once we see them, either directly or since they have to move and we can see them from the air with the capabilities we have, we can engage them, and I think that we have managed so far, according to the reports, both to arrest some of these people and to some dozens of them, and to hit many others. Hamas is well aware of the weaknesses they have, and they understand that direct fighting against IDF soldiers is quite dangerous for them. So the operational concept they adopt is to try to make the Israelis face mainly booby-traps from all kinds of ideas that they have, mines, explosives, these kinds of explosive charges and these kind of things, but avoid direct confrontation. And that's how we move slowly. We did manage to cross the open areas around the Gaza Strip, which was all full with booby-traps and problems. Based on the good information we had, we managed to, intelligence, we managed to cross this area and reach the populated area. And now, as a matter of fact, we actually encircle the city of Gaza. The people of Hamas that we have to fight against, I must say, are probably not as well trained as the Hezbollah people that we faced in 06. But they too are not an easy target. These are people that some hundreds of them, were trained in Iran. There were already 7 rounds of training in Iran of small groups of Hamas activists. Came back to the Gaza Strip and had the opportunity to instruct their units with whatever they have learned in Iran. So they're basically basic training is there, maybe a little bit more than that. Their abilities to produce ideas of explosives and booby-traps and so on and so forth is based on the knowledge that the Iranians gave them. Because the Iranians trained several engineers in Iran, and so they're not totally ignorant on these issues. On the contrary, I would say. So we are facing here an enemy that we have to treat with care and caution. It's not some sort of afternoon delight. It's very cautious, and by the way, I think that the way we do it until now is really impressive, in the sense that the number of casualties we had so far is minimal. And it's not that we are not encountering all the time those traps that were put by Hamas. As you know, most of the casualties we have so far are from our own friendly fire, which is something to be expected in an area like that. So we should do better. And the other thing that Hamas does is that they use their mortar shells, and they do it from within the populated area. Right now, most of the areas they have to operate from our populated area. And they don't mind, because they would like us very much to return fire and cause casualties within the ranks of the civilian population, because they believe this is going to be one of the major issues that is going to help them shorten the period of this operation and enable them to escape the unwanted results of this operation if it is going to last more. And they would like to see it end tomorrow, if possible, without them paying any significant price. So that's where they operate. And we see what happened yesterday in the UNRWA school, and every day this is going to accompany us. I guess we are trying very hard, and nobody suspects that Israelis shoot on purpose against the UN school. But this is the complex situation over there. And we have to return fire when we are shot at. And Hamas believes that this is going to help them escape the fate that might await them if nothing happens. Basically, I think that when you look at the ability of Hamas to withstand something like that for a long time, I put it this way. From the point of view of how long can they continue to launch rockets, they can continue to launch rockets from within the areas they govern for quite a while. And they are still an organized force. It's not, they haven't fallen apart. But the pressure of being totally isolated from the world, of being totally isolated from their own supporters, of not being able to get out from the bunkers where they hide, of the accumulated pressure of the population that wants to see an end to this situation, all of that creates a lot of pressure on the Hamas, and also as we continue to put pressure on the fighting elements within Hamas, their ability to continue fighting is eroded every day. And I'm sure that all kinds of problems are going to arise regarding their ability to fight. There's going to be less availability of long-range rockets. There's going to be less availability of people to do the launching. There's going to be a problem of how you divide the force when you're totally in a circle. Israel can put more pressure in this area or in that area. Depends how it decides. They have to defend all along the line. They are not necessarily in a situation to move their people from one part of the front to another part of the front. And Israel is going to continue biting the area and putting more and more pressure on them, and this is going to cost them people. And as I said before, they already paid some couple of hundreds of people since the ground operation started. So the pressure is building. This is a process that will take time. We are only something like 3.5 days in the ground operation. Most of it was used just to clear the way to the populated area. The direct pressure on the populated area, and the Hamas activists in the populated area, has just started. So in my mind, as the time goes by, this pressure is going to mount more and more. Now there's a difference between that and what happened in 2006. There's a big difference here, in the sense that this is happening in the capital of Hamas. Gaza is the capital of Hamas. This is not happening in the hilly areas somewhere down in the south, 80 kilometers away from Beirut. This is happening 2 meters away from the leaders. They are under direct threat. They feel the heat themselves. So it's the state of mind of being under siege that is making its impact on the leadership of Hamas as well. Time is the name of the game now. And I don't know what decisions the government is going to take, but in my mind, as a military analyst, I would say that time is the main issue. The pressure is going to mount every day. And if we are going to see what's the dilemma of Hamas? They cannot, and they wouldn't like to pay any price in the sense of their control of Gaza. They're solely controlling Gaza. They don't want to share that with anybody. Definitely they don't want to see the PA of Abu Mazen coming back. At the same time, if this is the case, then they're going to risk their survival. So there's a tension here. And as time goes by, they have to decide for themselves. Can we stick to the policy of insisting and having the right to launch rockets in the future in order to avoid and at the same time avoid the need to let the PA come back? And the pressure is going to be bigger and bigger. Right now, what I see from the Hamas point of view is that they're still saying if there's going to be a ceasefire, it's going to be a temporary one. And this is, in my mind, an opening bargaining position. Definitely, the Hamas understands that it was a mistake to force Israel to start this operation. Definitely, for a while, they are not going to launch rockets. But they have not yet given up the idea of launching rockets in the future. They have not yet given up the idea of trying immediately after this operation to try and bring more weapons from Iran through Sinai. They still want to see the Gaza as a base from which they can carry out terror operations against the civilian population in Israel. And I think that for them to understand that it's not only that for some period of time they have to refrain from doing that, but this is a new situation. They are never going to do that. This is going to take a little more time in my mind for them to understand that. And that's where we stand right now. This is the process, and it might be a long process. I don't know. Nobody can really guess how much time is actually needed for them to understand that. But I think that if you listen to what Osama Abu Hamdan is saying in Lebanon, to the way Zahar expresses his views from the bunker in Gaza, you understand that they are under a lot of pressure. So far, they hope that somehow the Egyptians will work out a deal that would enable them to gain something out of what's happening. But as time goes by, I think these hopes might evaporate. That's where we stand right now. Let me say one more thing about an issue that in my previous appearances here I was speaking about. The Iranians. The Iranians are clearly behind this operation in the sense that they were those who supported Hamas with money and with weapons that enabled them to be where they are. And I think that in one small respect they are even satisfied with what is happening. In the sense that everybody is now talking about Gaza. And nobody remembers that the Iranian nuclear clock keeps ticking every day. And they need that time. So from that respect, I think that from the Iranians can be quite satisfied with what's happening. On the other hand, if eventually Hamas is going to be weakened as a result of what's happening right now, that's of course something that the Iranians wouldn't like very much. And in this respect, I think that even from the Iranian point of view, ending it sooner than later with minimal damage to the Hamas control of Gaza is an interest at this point. Thank you.
To bring a halt to the indiscriminate rocket fire that Israeli civilians have had to absorb from the Gaza Strip since 2001, when the first Kassam rocket was launched. So that's 7 years of rocket fire that Israel hopes will now come to a permanent end. The second issue relates, of course, to what General Kuperwasser was speaking about, the Philadelphi route and the smuggling of weaponry into the Gaza Strip. It's interesting to go back to Israel's disengagement in 2005 to sort of look at the influence of Israel's withdrawal on the quantity and quality of weaponry that Israel had to face. Look, frankly, even when Israel was in the Gaza Strip, it did not manage to hermetically seal the Philadelphia route. By the way, it's called Philadelphia because that's a random term that came out of the IDF computer for labeling that specific route. It's not because somebody came from Philadelphia and he was the local lieutenant who was in charge of going into the tunnels. In any event, we were speaking about the numbers and how the quality and the quantity had changed. So as I said, Israel did not manage to hermetically seal it itself. But if you compare the number of rocket attacks against Israel in the year 2005, when Israel pulled out of Gaza and the Philadelphia route, to the number of rocket attacks in 2006, you see an increase from 179 rocket attacks in 2005 to 946 in 2006. That is an increase of at least 500%. Moreover, in 2006, that's the first time a Grad rocket is launched from Gaza in the direction of Ashkelon. Before that, they were the domestically produced Kassam rockets. So Israel's pullout and its lack of presence in the area allowed Hamas clearly to improve both the quantity and quality of the weaponry it had. And therefore, the Philadelphia route became even a more critical issue for protecting Israeli security as we look into the future. And I think that helps explain why Israel today must insist on dealing with the resupply of Hamas in the future. There's also the whole effect of UN Security Council Resolution 1701 and its impact on the Israeli perception of how to handle the Gaza crisis. Many of you might remember that UN Security Council Resolution 1701 helped reconstitute a stronger UNIFIL in southern Lebanon. And in terms of UNIFIL's mission, it did not instruct UNIFIL to block the smuggling of weaponry, of Iranian weaponry, from Syria into Lebanon, unless Lebanon made a request that that be the UNIFIL mission. Now, as long as Hezbollah still had a dominant influence on the decisions of the Lebanese government, Lebanon was never going to ask UNIFIL to stop the smuggling of Iranian weapons from Syria into Lebanon as a result of that lacuna in the UN resolution. Today, Iran has managed to supply, along with Syria, weaponry to Hezbollah so that Hezbollah has more weaponry today than it did in 2006. Any Israeli policy planner does not want to repeat that error when we reach a ceasefire with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And that perhaps gives Israel even more motivation to obtain a dependable arrangement in the Philadelphia route. As far as issues of the international community today, I'm just going to mention two or three. First of all, clearly the tragic events that occurred at the Jabalia UNRWA school have probably filled up the discussion in the United Nations today and among many countries that are looking at the current situation. I have to say, however, that more and more evidence is coming out which seems to give credibility to Israel's argument that what happened in that school, in the UNRWA school, was a result of mortar fire by a Hamas cell against Israeli forces and Israeli counter-battery fire against that mortar unit. In fact, Associated Press, who might even be here today, reported last night, and I'll just quote their report, 2 residents of the area who spoke with the Associated Press by telephone said they saw a small group of militants firing mortar rounds from a street near the school. So there seems to be local evidence, which a very brave AP Stringer managed to get out of the Gaza Strip, that supports that, and also Israel's recent experiences with UNRWA. Some of you might remember that on October 31st, 2007, the Israeli Air Force photographed the firing of mortars from an UNRWA school in Beit Hanun, that's in the northern Gaza Strip. Well, Israel just didn't leave it there, having this photographic evidence. It took it to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in New York, basically arguing, why are you allowing UNRWA schools to be militarized and become a base of activity against the state of Israel or against Israeli forces? It so happens that there are United Nations resolutions that deal with this. When I served at the UN, one of the biggest problems the UN was facing was the militarization of refugee camps in Africa, in the Congo, for example. And therefore, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution 1208, which talked about I'm quoting, the unacceptability of using refugee camps and other persons in refugee camps to achieve military purposes. 2 years later, in the year 2000, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution 1296, which required that the Secretary General report situations in which, quote, camps are vulnerable to infiltration by armed elements, unquote. Much of this came up in the Israeli-Palestinian context when the Jenin refugee camp was used by various Palestinian terrorist groups as a place of refuge. And in fact, at the time, U.S. congressmen were writing to the Secretary General, at that time Kofi Annan, complaining about the militarization of Palestinian camps and the fact that the UN had done nothing to stop it. So I definitely believe that this background will be part of the discussion in New York. You should know that after Israel wrote in November of 2007 to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon requesting an investigation, Secretary General said the matter in the Beit Hanun UNRWA school would be investigated. But to this day, Israel has not received a report about the UN investigation of Beit Hanun. All this is background to show that the terrible events that are occurring are perhaps the result of a cumulative problem that has existed for many years of UNRWA schools being militarized and Hamas using schools, hospitals, and innocent civilians as human shields for its military operations. In terms of how we're likely to see things develop, clearly there are two interests at play in the diplomatic drive to achieve a ceasefire with some dependable mechanism to prevent smuggling through the Philadelphia route. The Hamas has an interest in a very quick ceasefire, which will deny Israel its aims of getting an arrangement that permanently halts rocket fire and also halts the smuggling through the Philadelphia route. They just want to see a quick statement made by the Security Council, perhaps a resolution, that would simply draw a line and bring the Israeli military operation to an end. Israel has the stated purposes which I mentioned to you, seeing that a serious arrangement is made, not just a tahadiyah, an Arabic term for a calm, which is not even a quarter of a hudna, which is like maybe a half of a ceasefire. So Israel wants something more permanent, more binding, and something which affects the smuggling. What should be the international interest in this matter? I believe that perhaps one issue which many people have not focused on up until now are the international dimensions of this conflict. That they go well beyond the Gaza Strip, well beyond southern Israel. Because after all, who is Hamas? Read the Hamas charter. It's the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood is one of the main opposition elements in Egypt to the continuing rule of President Mubarak. It is an opposition element which has become even more radicalized in Jordan against King Abdullah. And the Muslim Brotherhood is active all around the world. In the UK, Risalat al-Ikhwan, their journal which they publish in London, they wouldn't dare publish in Cairo. But it's published and they have followers. And they have followers in Paris and in various European capitals. Now, what if the outcome of this conflict is a premature ceasefire in which Israel's most minimal and, in my judgment, reasonable demands are not satisfied? Comes the Hamas and they declare, we have held off the Israeli army, we have won this conflict. What is the international implications of that declaration? What are the international implications of that declaration? I wrote many years ago a book on the rise of Al-Qaeda and the impact of Saudi Arabia. And it was my conclusion from studying the issue that radical Islam, militant Islam, which endangers the security of Middle Eastern countries, whether it's the state of Israel or Egypt or Jordan, radical Islam thrives on the sense that it has been victorious in its military confrontations with its adversaries. When was Al-Qaeda created? Was Al-Qaeda created because the Soviets went into Afghanistan? Al-Qaeda was created after the Soviets were defeated and withdrew. And in the aftermath of that withdrawal and the celebration of the victory of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden builds Al-Qaeda. When does Hamas take over the Palestinian Authority? After Israel unilaterally withdraws from the Gaza Strip And instead of Abu Mazen being empowered, the Palestinian street census, Hamas has just scored a huge victory with its Kassam rockets, as opposed to all the negotiations that went on in the Oslo years. So that if at the end of this struggle, it is perceived that Hamas has managed to hold off Israel, has denied Israel its most minimal aims, that will not just be a perception that will strengthen Hamas. In my judgment, it will strengthen radical Islamist groups in many parts of the Middle East, I would even say into Europe as well. And therefore, I think the international interest, although this isn't always perceived this way, the international interest at present is that Israel complete its military mission and accomplish a halt of the rocket attacks and a cessation of the smuggling in the Philadelphia route. If that is accomplished, that will provide certainly security for Sderot, for Ashkelon, Ashdod, and now Beersheba. But I think it will also strengthen the security of our common interests in Cairo, in Amman, in Paris, and in London. I'll stop here and we'll both be available for questions.
Okay, Ellie, go ahead. Use the microphone, please, because we need it for the transcription of the tape.
Ellie Darshut from Nikkei. Question for each of you, of course. Could you, Dore, please give us your quick take on the Obama factor and his comments yesterday and what has not happened up until now and what we could expect in 2 weeks? And a question that I, as a journalist that work for a foreign media, have had a hard time explaining to my colleagues in the last week or so. When I explained that Israel is under attack and this is why this finally had to happen, the response from my desk is that the occupation is still underway or is still in existence. Even though when I claimed disengagement in 2005, we pulled back, they will always say that the firing of the rockets is because Israel has closed off the borders, whether it was the port or the airport, from day one. And how can Israel refute this or make a case that Israel is not occupying the Gaza Strip even after the disengagement? And Colonel, General, is it? I'm sorry. Assuming a ceasefire is reached, what will Israel's position be? No rockets are being fired into southern Israel, but a wave of suicide bombings begin in the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, whatever. What will Israel do? Can they start targeting, striking Gaza? Certainly they can't do it in the West Bank.
We'll need an hour if you ask another question. General, do you want to handle that, or Dore, how do you feel? General, you want to take the? You can actually answer from here. Okay, come on up then. Fine.
Okay, well, regarding the what is going to happen if there are terror attacks, we shall have to defend ourselves against terror attacks from all kinds, not only rockets. The point is that we have been very successful in the last few years in preventing terror attacks from coming from Gaza. And this goes back to what you asked Dore about closing the border. We have to keep very close control of the border to prevent those terrorists from coming in. And to prevent them from getting arms that would enable them to launch rockets against us. And this is why we do that. We don't do that just because we like to close borders. And if there are going to be terror attacks in spite of the control of the border, then we shall have to take steps in order to defend ourselves. Depends on where it's coming from. In the West Bank, the point is that through our presence over there, and based on the security fence, we have managed to bring down the number of suicide bombing attacks inside Israel to more or less nothing.
I just want to add that the motivation level now is high.
We have to take even to put even more effort in collecting the information and intelligence necessary in order to prevent any such attack from happening. And it's not that there were no attacks. You know, we had Merkaz Arav and we had the Drisa,
The run over the automobile
attacks and things like that.
Caterpillar, the tractor terror.
We did have attacks. It's not that it stopped, but it's almost nothing. Definitely compared with what we used to have in 2002 until 2000 until 2004. Let's say, put it this way. So we know how to take steps in order to cope with such a situation. If it's going to be needed to move back into Gaza Strip, we shall be able to do that. But I think nobody wanted to have this operation, and we have no appetite for more operations in the future. That's why I think what's most important is to make sure that the results of this operation are such that there's not going to be a need for another operation like that in the future. And it's, if we, to repeat what Dore said, if we finish short of that, finish in an undecided manner, it's not enough. We need to reach more than that.
Dan, can you forgive me, because the second part of my question was connected to my first question, and that is, if Israel's trying to extract a price tag from Hamas in Gaza for rocket fire, there will be retaliation. What is the price tag for suicide bombings when there are no rockets coming in?
We're not involved in this game of price tag. We shall not tolerate any terror against Israel. We take the necessary steps, but we shall work out when it happens. And let's not discuss hypothetical situations. If this is going to be the case, Israel will have to come up with a solution to this problem. We have to. The idea here for going to this operation was that we have tried everything. You know, the government took really a lot of heat from everybody, and being restrained for such a long time in spite of the fact that the rockets kept falling. And we really tried to see if there is a chance to reach a hudna, and Israel was ready to resume the hudna. You know, the Israeli officials went to Egypt in order to resume the hudna. It was the Hamas who didn't want to do that. So we really went through everything possible in order to keep a situation that was not to our liking, but was less than what we see today. And nevertheless, this was not the attitude of Hamas. So right now we are in the middle of an effort to relieve the citizens of the southern part of Israel from the threat they are facing. And they were facing for 7 years, as Dore mentioned. So that's what we want to be. We want to be in a situation where this threat is moved away. If, in spite of that, the terror attacks will resume, be it terror attacks from using rockets or terror attacks of suicide bombers, we'll have to take action again.
First of all, regarding the question about the President-elect Barack Obama, we don't know even who his whole team will be. So it's very hard to make assessments about how the Obama administration will be different from the Bush administration. We expect that the traditionally close ties between Israel and the United States will continue. And the support for Israel has been common to both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the United States. And therefore, to try and work in how Barack Obama's policies affect how Israel might or might not pursue this conflict seems to be a little bit excessive. Moving on to the question of occupation, I think your colleagues who you speak to have to remember, you are in a military combat zone. This is not like some kind of area in the South Pacific where Israel is closing off access to Gaza port, and therefore it's going to keep large cruise liners full of tourists away. The problem we're facing, first of all, as General Kuperwasser noted, Hamas, despite the fact that it is a Sunni organization, a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, is allied with Iran completely. If tomorrow Israel were to say, you know what, we don't really care about our security, go ahead, open Gaza port, we're going to have Iranian boats that somehow got through the Suez Canal coming to Gaza port with weapons. You don't have to put it on these sneak the weapons in through the tunnels. So anybody who's relating to a combat zone has to understand the limitations that Israel's living with. Since Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip in 2005, Al-Qaeda affiliates have sprung up in the Gaza Strip. One is called Jaish al-Ummah, another is called Jaish al-Islam. They're somewhat dependent on local gangs who have been involved in all kinds of illegal activities for many years, but they also involve Yemeni operatives, Sudanese operatives, some people from Egypt who have snuck in. These are according to reports in Al-Khayat. And therefore, if we were, again, open up Gaza, full access, we'd be creating Waziristan on the Mediterranean. And that wouldn't be very smart, neither for us nor for any of our neighbors. And therefore, Israel has to be very careful until it has a reasonable peace partner it can work with, and then implement the kind of careful mechanisms that were put into the Oslo II interim agreement. We can't just simply open up these areas and allow anybody to come in. Now, with regard to that nasty O word, occupation, I have to say I think we've been using this term too loosely. When Israel, take one step back. Go open up the Fourth Geneva Convention from 1949. What defines an occupation? What defines an occupation is the existence of a military government over a civilian population where an army has gone in and occupied the area. It's the military government. Now, with the Oslo agreements, when Israel dissolved its military government, and you no longer had Colonel Yossi governing Ramallah, but you had Palestinian Authority officials governing these areas under Yasser Arafat, a new status was born for the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It wasn't an independent state, but it wasn't a military occupation either. Now, the reason why Palestinian spokesmen love to use the word occupation is because they believe that there is a principle that somehow exists in the international legal community, that there is a right to resistance to occupation. And that way they can take their concept of mukawama and jihad and put it in international legal terms. There is no international legal right to resist occupation. You will not find a UN resolution, except some that maybe some implicit hints, but there is no UN Security Council resolution certainly that allows for use of violence against a government in a particular area to change the status quo. Now, that's true with regard to a real occupation. But when you have a situation like Oslo, which creates a hybrid between an independent state under Yasser Arafat in the 1990s and a place where the Israeli military is present, to use the word occupation and say that that might justify the launching of rockets against Israel is really taking international law and turning it on its head.
General, a technical question. Due to the close connections between Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah, there has been a lot of speculation that they might have the smuggled into the Gaza Strip sophisticated anti-tank missiles like the Russian Concurse or Kornet, for instance, and also they might have the Al-Fajr 3 unguided rocket. What is the assessment of military intelligence concerning these possibilities, and why haven't they used so far these weapons? Is it going to be a surprise for military intelligence if they use it or not?
This is what happened there. These anti-tank missiles are made specifically for longer ranges. These are for something like 5 kilometers range, and they are very effective, as you know. You don't have the need for that in the context of Gaza, where you have to shoot from much shorter ranges. But the Hamas has other weapons of anti-tank weapons, starting by the RPGs and the Yossi rocket that they are producing themselves based on the RPG. And I won't be at all surprised. I don't know if the intelligence is going to be surprised, but I personally I'm not going to be surprised if they also have things like concours, for example, and these kind of weapons. This is to be expected. I'm sure, without even knowing if this is the case or not, but I'm sure that the military operates under the assumption that these weapons are there. Because if you can smuggle in a rocket of the size of the Grad, which is quite a long one, a missile that is small and short, you definitely can smuggle in ample amounts. And I'm not sure they do, because I don't know how much money the smugglers do on that. But it has to be taken into consideration. Now, regarding the longer range rockets, these are Hamas tries to create the impression that they might have them. They have something that goes bad or bad, farther and farther than even what they have today. So far, this has not been proved, and I don't know if this is the case. That's every other move you can say to yourself, well, why don't they use it now if they have it? But maybe they save it for some doomsday or the last moment. Maybe they have only one or two like that, and that's why they keep it. Basically, we haven't seen anything. The way Israel prepared itself, as you can see, is based on the assumption, probably coming from the intelligence, that Hamas has rockets that goes up to a little bit more than 40 kilometers range. These are those improved, extended range Grad rockets. This is, as you can see, where the Israelis prepared themselves. This goes from Gedera in the north, tip of the southern part of Israel, and to Beersheba on the other side. This is the range of the 40 kilometers. From that, I understand that the intelligence probably doesn't take very seriously the probability that Hamas does have some rockets with longer range. The Fajr is a very heavy rocket. It's not going to be easy to smuggle it in, although some of the tunnels are big enough for that purpose. You can basically, technically, bring them in. I'm sure, by the way, that I can say, and I think this is the most important thing about it. I'm sure that if the arrangements that are going to be in place in Gaza after this war would not take care of the issue of smuggling properly, then these rockets will come in. Because the lesson learned by the Hamas right now is that having rockets with ranges up to 40 kilometers, and with the kind of warheads they have right now, the size of the warhead they have right now, doesn't make enough impression on the Israelis. And they continue fighting. And you can of course feel, and I guess the Hamas understands this as well, that the Israeli population in the areas that are affected by the rockets is not scared. I mean, every person is scared if something's going to fall on him, but in general, the population is strong. And Israel is determined to continue fighting in spite of those rifles. And the fact that they speak about longer range rockets already hints at what are they going to do once the war is over and they still have the opportunity to bring in more weapons. So in my mind, we have to take into consideration that the next round, if this round doesn't end properly, the next round would involve longer range weapons. And look at what happens in Lebanon right now. With the 1701 phrased in the way that Dore mentioned, not forcing the Lebanese to take action against the resupply of Hezbollah. According to what we hear from every intelligence source, the weapons that Hezbollah has today is a longer range and many more in numbers than what they had in 06. So what are we to expect from Hamas in the next round if we don't take proper action against it? And that's, in my mind, something that we have to keep in mind.
Yes, please.
Mats Giselius representing Swedish and Finnish press. Ambassador Gold, you gave an outline of the aims of Israel and factors that the international community ought to consider. But you also know the UN from the inside and the way the different players are reasoning. What is the likely outcome? What is the likely development diplomatically the following period here, next few weeks?
Well, one of the difficulties that you face when you're dealing with the UN Security Council are the multiple interests that are represented among the P5, the permanent 5 members. And to the extent to which the Europeans, the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese take different approaches, it's going to be hard to get agreement. If you start with the supposition that there is an Iranian interest in denying Israel certain goals being fulfilled with a resolution, should Moscow represent those Iranian interests, then you're going to have a clear divergence in the Security Council. I'm not sure you're going to have a wide divergence between the French and the British on the one hand and the United States on the other hand. Although President Sarkozy has proposed a humanitarian ceasefire for a limited period of time, 48 hours.
Ms. Rice have expressed some interest in as well. So
That's true. But nonetheless, there's a fundamental understanding of the two dimensions of Israel's demands. Number one, the cessation of rocket launches against Israel, and number two, the problem of the supply in the Philadelphia route. There may be differences about the modalities for handling the Philadelphia route. Do you rely on European Union monitors, for example? Or do you bring in United States engineering units? And I really just don't know where these different modalities stand right now. But there is fundamental understanding of the strategic aim. Now, if the UN is not the place where we're able to reach a resolution of this, then we may have to create ad hoc arrangements that go outside the UN for bringing about a resolution of this. Probably the most important player who's not sitting in the Security Council is Egypt. And if Egypt, Israel, the United States, and several other Arab states come to an understanding about how to bring this to an end, that might be as important as the consensus that's being sought in the UN Security Council. You also have to remember that the Sunni Arab states have a very different interest than Iran. And I think it was President Mubarak was quoted in the Israeli press as saying, in Gaza I have an Egyptian border with the Iranians. So obviously the whole question of Iran's role in the Arab world is very much a part of the set of interests that will be at play when discussing the type of arrangements that can be reached.
Can I just follow up? Mostly General Kuperwasser talked about time being of essence for the Israeli for this campaign. How much time would you say that the international community is willing to give Israel for this, for fulfilling this? I mean, what's the time schedule for what's going on in the diplomatic?
Well, I think you have two levels of what is occurring in the international community. On the one hand, you have the response to media stories coming out of Gaza, which tend to focus on the operations of the Israel Defense Forces. And those who respond to that narrative that the problem is the Israeli response, obviously are looking for a very short time frame. And that can also affect publics in the Middle East. But those who look at this from the standpoint of their national interests understand that we cannot grant Hamas victory of any sort. That the implications of a Hamas victory, or even Hamas surviving with Israel's goals denied, are far greater than just the Gaza Strip and the immediate environs, that it will affect the attitude and approach of radical Islamic groups across the Middle East. If Hamas claims victory, it's a shot of adrenaline into the veins of radical Islam and Iranian expansionism in the Middle East.
So what time frame that? How long?
So you have
How
a
much time does Israel have?
look. I'm not going to count this in days, but you obviously have two fundamentally contradictory interests. Those who accept the Hamas narrative, but the problem is stopping the Israeli military assault into the Gaza Strip. Those who accept that narrative want this thing to end in the next 2 hours. Those who accept that the problem is Hamas's assault on Israel and Iran's effort to create a military position on the Eastern Mediterranean beyond what it already has in Lebanon, those people want to see Israel achieve its military aims in this war of self-defense.
David Essing, a journalist. You both have stressed the importance of Egypt in preventing arms smuggling in the future and so forth. And I've never been able to understand the Egyptian role because in closed forums, Israeli leaders, intelligence experts and so forth have always said that Egypt has not done enough for one reason or another. Now, what is there in the mix today that would lead Egypt to play a really efficient role in preventing the arms smuggling? And if I may be permitted a second question to both of you, if Hamas is so interested in an immediate ceasefire, should Israel insist, make a condition of Gilad Shalit's release to be part of the deal?
Regarding Egypt, first of all, I think that we can say that the Egyptians could have done much more than what they have done in order to prevent the smuggling, because these weapons didn't fall from the sky. They got into Gaza somehow, and the only way to get into Gaza is through the Philadelphi area. And as I mentioned before, there are so many tunnels, and the Egyptians didn't, they were closing tunnels all the time. But the pace with which they were closing the tunnels was all the time lagging behind the pace in which the children of Rafah were digging new ones. And the weapons are coming in. I mean, there are not so many routes getting to Rafah. These weapons don't necessarily come by sea. They come along some relatively well-known routes inside Sinai. So the dissatisfaction that you hear from Israelis, politicians and the intelligence people about what was going on in Sinai is probably justified. I think that the Egyptians for a long time thought that it's not it's dangerous a little bit, but the situation is not going to get out of control. And we'll play it by the year. We have to keep the people in Sinai satisfied. They make a living out of that. We don't want to fight against them. We don't want to confront Hamas. And at the same time, this is not going to explode, so it's not so bad. What happened now was that it did explode. And there's much more pressure on the Egyptians right now to take steps. And throughout that time, they were also very cautious not to make the Americans unhappy with them. We heard here and there was, don't complain with the Americans. If you have any problems, come to us. Now the Americans are also fed up with this because they do understand now what was going here because of the shortcomings of the Egyptians. So there's more pressure on the Egyptians to do something about it. And I think that the Egyptians have now a bigger interest in doing so. Are they going to be creating a foolproof system along the border that would prevent any smuggling? You know, if you could have relied on that, it would have been very good. But I think Israel has this experience in that it has to take to see how the new situation is going to be different than the one we had until now. Egypt and the international community has to prove to Israel what is going to be different now than what we saw until now. How are we going to be? How can we be assured that from now on no smuggling is going to take place? How can we be assured that Hamas understand that they cannot try and even go this way? And I believe that Egypt has to come with some sort of a clear operational idea that would ensure that this is going to be the case. Sorry, Gilad Shalit. I think that we would like very much to see some link to the Gilad Shalit issue coming out of this war, but this was never a part of the goals of this war and or this operation. And I don't think that we should force it to become a part of it. If something comes out, wonderful, we would like to see something like that, but this is not a condition. It shouldn't be a condition. This war is about making sure that the southern part of Israel is quiet. And I hope that since this is one of the issues that are between us and the Hamas, the war will also create some channel through which we can sort out this problem as well. But we didn't go to that war because of Gilad Shalit, and we shouldn't force a mixture between the two issues, in my mind.
I think the Gilad Shalit issue will naturally come up for one very simple reason. We are going to be holding a lot of Hamas prisoners. And this may be an opportunity to force Hamas to finally relinquish their control of him. By the way, just as a parenthetical note of interest, Gilad Shalit was seized by Hamas, but also by other organizations who joined in a joint operation. One of them was Jaish al-Islam, one of those al-Qaeda affiliates that I mentioned. So, this has obviously been a fundamental problem for us for a very long time, and maybe we will have new leverage now to pry Gilad Shalit out of captivity. Certainly, it's an issue that's of tremendous concern to most Israelis, and it naturally comes up with the issue of a prisoner exchange.
Excuse me, there's a side of this room too. You've taken everybody from that side, you haven't taken anybody from this side. It's not fair. It's undemocratic.
Would you relinquish to the annoyed lady in the front, please?
I'm not just annoyed for me, I'm annoyed for this lady too, and anybody else. Put up your hand.
Please.
You can't be one-eyed.
Bevakasha.
We've mentioned UNRWA, the school, but we really haven't mentioned, or nobody's mentioned today.
Can you just announce your affiliation?
I'm sorry, I'm Guri Cashman from the Jerusalem Post.
Thanks.
We haven't mentioned the huge number of Palestinian children who have been killed. Now, before and during the Second World War, Jewish children were smuggled out of Europe, and some came not smuggled on kinder transport to England. Why has nothing been done to take Gazan children out of Gaza so at least they could survive even if their parents could not?
The role of non-combatants, specifically children, is part of the horrible drama of this conflict. But you know very well, Greer, that the state of Israel goes through or undertakes incredible measures to try and minimize civilian casualties as much as we see them occurring. If Israel simply wanted to cause civilian casualties on the Palestinian side, it would not risk the lives of ground forces who are now engaged in house-to-house operations in Gaza. And it would use the Russian Chechen style of warfare, which is just blasting with artillery whole neighborhoods and removing everything that's posing a threat to you at once. There is increasing evidence showing that Hamas is deliberately using a policy of human shields in the way it's waging war. There are in fact recordings on YouTube of Hamas leaders speaking about using human shields in children. The IDF has seen with reconnaissance aircraft Hamas militants and terrorists taking children in hand to protect themselves from IDF strikes. The question is, where does this put the moral responsibility of the parties involved in the losses on the Palestinian civilian side? Michael Walzer, who wrote an extraordinary book, Just and Unjust Wars, is a Princeton University professor of philosophy, actually wrote on this subject in the New Republic during 2006, because this actually came up during during the Second Lebanon War. Walzer's conclusions were very candid, and he said the responsibility for the killing of children that are used as human shields is the responsibility of the terrorist organizations. Now, does that mean Israel can just napalm Jabalia and say, well, too bad, Hamas put them there? No. You have to use every means possible to minimize civilian casualties. International law, by the way, assumes that civilian casualties will occur in conflict. What international law says is that the military commander has to make an evaluation when he chooses a target. Is the military benefit of destroying that target greater than the risk to civilians who may be in the area? If the military value of the target is greater than the risk, then that is called proportional use of force in international law. If the risk is greater to the civilians in the area, to the value of the military target, then that is called disproportional use of force in international law. But again, I would underline, historically, in fighting in closed-in areas like refugee camps, Israel is using ground forces primarily to achieve its military aims. In the Jenin refugee camp, the IDF lost over 20 reserve soldiers in house-to-house combat rather than simply winning that battle with the use of air power and artillery. So I believe that the high command of the Israeli army is extremely careful about civilian losses. I also know from Doron Almog, who joined me by satellite in London for a conference on universal jurisdiction, that in the Southern Command of the IDF, military decisions about targeting are decided in consultation with legal advisors through the whole IDF chain of command, at the level of the Southern Command commander, at the level of the chief of staff, and at the level of the Israeli government. So when you're dealing with an ugly enemy like Hamas, who has made a decision to use human shields, and that decision can be documented in statements they've made on their TV, this puts a moral society like Israel in a very difficult dilemma. And I see the IDF trying to use the moral guidelines that international law has supplied Western armies for years in trying to minimize the problem. In fact, I don't know of a single army in the world that sends SMS messages to civilians to get out of the way because their house contains munitions that were put there by Hamas.
So you can recover your place of line here.
Thanks. My name is Ari Kusel from Orange County, a Muslim World Today. 2 questions, please. How does Israel fare in the public diplomacy front? It seems that both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and others believe that we're doing phenomenally well. Secondly, would you comment, Brigadier General, about the Israeli Arab population and its response?
Oh. I don't think I'm not going to comment on the Israeli Arab population. I don't think that there's anything to comment. We have some reservations about the operation. Find their ways to express it. It's a we are living in a democracy, and they can say whatever they like, as long as it's within the framework of the law. But let me just say one word about the previous question. If it was up to us, we would like very much to see the children getting out of this area. For the military, it's a much easier situation to operate in an area where you don't have civilians. And definitely not children. Not children. That's the Hamas reason for keeping them there is that they, as Dore said, are some sort of not fully, they cannot really serve as total shields, they already understand that, but it's a consideration Israel has to take in order to avoid attacking them. And what we saw was the case of Nizar, for example, and in previous cases as well, was that when we were trying to attack some place and we were telling the Hamas or Nizar that we are going to attack his house, because it was a place where we kept rockets. What he did was bringing in his family and the children to protect the place. We also have to remember in this respect that the children in Gaza are exposed all the time to this hatred education, and they are taught that this is what they should be. They should become shaheed. So for them, it's not something against their way of thinking that somebody would put them in a place like that and they turn into shaheeds. Then that's all to the better. So that is the policy of Hamas, the declared policy of Hamas, as a matter of fact. And we have